Yes
Yes
po.
po.
Okay. So sana makatulong po yung ating ina-upload, no? So far, actually class, I'm happy with the results of your exams. Kasi although 'di ba, ano tayo ang tawag dito, pandemic, lahat online. So sa ating sa ating auditing theory, halos matataas yung mga results ng exam, 'di ba? No ninyo. So syempre within a short period of time, ang ikli lang ng ating this sem, ilang buwan lang, 3 buwan lang kasi kalagitnaan ng September, October, November, tapos kalahati lang rin ng December, 3 buwan. So pero imagine 'di ba, napaka okay ng result nyo. Yung sa ating audit problem, although may iba magagaling ang daming magagaling. Yung iba naman, ano lang, practice lang ng practice. So, kapag may hindi kayo naintindihan, pwede naman kayo magtanong sa akin or you can rewatch our YouTube discussion, yung discussion natin. So, ang sabi nga ng iba, ng mga board top notcher, practice and practice, di ba? To make it perfect. So, hindi kasi tayo perfect, di ba? We are not perfect. Although, practicing it more frequently makes it perfect. All right. Okay, class. So, ang dami ko ng kwento. Let me share my screen. Saan na tayo? Ayan. Can you see my screen, class?
Yes po.
Yes po.
Ayan. Okay. So, chapter 6 na tayo, no? So, chapter 6, consideration of internal control. Kapag kino-consider pala natin ang internal control, tulad ng pinag-aralan natin kanina or last week, kasi para makatulong, di ba? Para makatulong sa external auditor. Paano makakatulong ang internal control sa external auditor? Anyone from the class? Anyone from the class? Yes, Ron Mark.
Sir, opinion lang po. Kapag maganda po kasi yung internal control ng isang, ng management po mismo, or ng isang company po, parang yung auditor po, less na po yung work niya since mag-rely na lang din po siya sa internal control. Tapos yung errors po, then fraud na madedetect po, konti na lang din po.
Yes, that's correct, no? So, tama yung sinabi ni Ron, Mark. Kasi yung internal control, it can help the external auditor to do lesser work through substantive testing. So, okay yung internal control para ma-prove, kasi tayo auditor tayo, we have to apply professional skepticism. Kahit na magre-rely tayo sa work ng ibang expert. Kasi yung assessment for internal control, ina-assess yan normally ng internal auditors. Pwede rin tayo mag-assess. Although we can rely doon sa report ng internal auditor na ay okay yung internal control. Syempre, applying your professional skepticism. So, yan. Applying the professional skepticism. Yan. You need to conduct test of control for good internal controls. Yan. Kaya mo ginagawa ang test of control kapag maganda ang internal control kasi guided ka by professional skepticism. Di ba mapagduda tayo bilang auditor, hindi tayo agad-agad naniniwala doon sa report na binigay ng iba. So kahit na mag-rely tayo, we still need to conduct procedures from our side because of the professional skepticism. At kapag maganda ang internal control, tapos nag-rely kayo, anong tawag doon sa strategy na yan, class, if you still remember?
Reliance strategy.
Yes, that's correct, no? Reliance strategy. Okay. Yeah. Reliance strategy. So, Yan ang ating ginagawa kapag nagre-rely tayo sa internal control. Tandaan ang reliance strategy kasi kapag nandoon na tayo sa dulo-dulo, may maririnig na kayo doon na mga risk of reliance. Yon. So, risk of over-reliance, risk of under-reliance. Mapag-aaralan nyo yan. Para at least napagdudugtong natin. Kasi ito, hindi to binabanggit dito sa mga libro na binibili natin. Walang reliance strategy. Pero magugulat kayo sa dulo, bakit may risk of over-reliance, risk of under-reliance? So, eto pala yon. Okay, so pag-aaralan natin. So, pag-aaralan natin yan sa mga susunod pa. Alright. Anong auditing standards ang may cover for internal control consideration? So aside from GAAS, di ba? It is the second standard, ayan, second standard of field work. So ayan, lagyan natin dito GAAS. So sa under GAAS, it is the second standard of field work. Consideration of internal control. Ano kaya yung PSAs na may cover for internal control? Meron pa po bang nakakaalam? Ano yung PSA na may sakop kay internal control consideration? Meron po bang idea? Yes. Anyone from the class?
PSA 315.
PSA 300.
15.
PSA 315. So ano yung PSA 315? What's PSA 315? Ano kaya ibig sabihin nun? What's PSA 315? Sige, lagyan natin dito. PSA 315. What do we mean by PSA 315? Anyone from the class? Yes, Dominic.
Identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement through the understanding the entity and its environment.
That's correct, no? Identifying the risk of material misstatement. Lagay ko lang MM, ha? Material misstatement through understanding, yan, understanding the entity and its environment. So, under PSA 315, para maintindihan natin yung entity, yung client mismo, pati yung environment niya, we have to include, kasi nakasulat to sa PSA 315 eh, you have to include, lagay ko lang dito, include the internal control. Yun yung sinabi mismo ng PSA 315. You have to include the internal control of the client entity. And then, you have to check for any material weaknesses. Ayan. So, weaknesses in internal control. So, yan yung sinasabi ng PSA 315. Napapakinggan pa po ba ako, class?
Yes,
Yes.
po.
Alright. Ayan. So, lagay ko lang dyan. Ayan. PSA 315. Anong sabi ng PSA 315? You need to identify the risk of material misstatement through understanding the entity and its environment. Ano bang sabi ng PSA 315? You have to include the entity's internal control. Kaya dapat mong i-consider. Tapos ano pa? Check for any material weaknesses in the internal control. Kapag na-check mo yung material weaknesses in the entity's internal control, you have to identify the risks involved and assessing the material misstatements. So, i-check mo ano yung risk involved and then i-assess mo gaano kalaki yung material misstatement. Kasi nakita mo may weakness na sa internal control. So, syempre, kailangan mo i-assess, may weakness na. Ano yung risk involved? I-assess mo rin yung material misstatement. And then after that, you have to document the internal control, weakness, and assessed risk. Bakit mo kailangan i-document? Kasi anong sabi ng PSA? Failure to document an audit procedure is tantamount to non-doing the audit process accurately. So yun yung sinabi ng PSA natin. Bawal na hindi ka magdo-document. So on all phases of audit, kailangan ka mag-document. Kasi pala, kapag hindi pala tayo nag-document bilang isang auditor, lumalabas, hindi pala tayo nag-conduct ng maayos na audit. So always tayo magdo-document. Aside from PSA 315, you have to consider ano pang isang PSA. Yes, John Philip.
PSA 265 po.
That's correct, no? So tama po 'yon. What's PSA 265? What's PSA?
Communicating internal control deficiencies po.
Yan, all right. Sige po, ayusin ko lang ha. PSA 265 means communicating the deficiencies in the internal control to those charged with governance. Ayan. To those charged with governance. Alright. Okay, lagay ko dito. Highlight ko ulit ito. Ayan. So aside from PSA 315, may i-consider pa kayo. Communicating the internal control deficiencies in the internal control to those charged with governance. Anong ginawa niyo sa PSA 315? Kailangan ma-identify niyo yung risk ng material misstatement by checking or understanding the entity and its environment. Paano mo maintindihan? Kailangan isama mo yung internal control. Kapag isinama mo yung internal control, kinonsider mo siya, matche-check mo, baka merong material weakness. Kapag may material weakness, i-check mo yung risk involved and then i-assess mo gaano kalaki yung degree ng material misstatement. Pagkatapos nun, you have to document the internal control weakness and then the assessed risk. Kapag na-check ninyo na merong weakness, yun yung tinatawag nating deficiency. You have to communicate it to those charged with governance. So may maririnig kayo doon, those charged with governance, also known as PCWG. So yung those charged with governance, ang tawag sa kanila ay mga board of directors. So yung board of directors ay ang tawag sa ating PSA, ang term sa kanila is those charged with governance. Kasi sila yung parang governing body or ruling body sa loob ng isang company. Kapag may lumabas sa problem, 'di ba? Mayroong example problem. Maglalagay ako dito. Example problem. Who is responsible pala? Who is responsible for the preparation of the financial statements? Yan, lagay natin ha. Example lang yan ha. Letter A, client management. Letter B, internal auditor. Letter C, external auditor. Letter D, none of the above. So, what's your answer, class?
A.
Letter A.
Answer
Client
is
management.
letter A, client management. Pero kapag may nilagay ako dito, letter D, those charged with governance. So what will be your answer? A, B, C, D. Who is responsible for the preparation of the financial statements? The best answer here is those charged with governance. Siya na yung pipiliin nyo, hindi na si client management. Kasi siya yung pinaka-ultimate responsible for the preparation of the financial statement. Nakukuha po ba, class? Nagigets po ba?
Yes po.
Yes po.
Okay. So, yan yung sinasabi ko. Merong mga tricky question sa auditing problems or auditing theory kung saan akala natin si client management na pero pag may pumasok na those charged with governance, si those charged with governance na yung best answer. Eh, minsan sabihin natin, may lumalabas na problem, none of the above, sasabihin dito client management or PWCG. So answer is client management and then PWCG. PCWG pala. Those charged with governance. All right. Okay, so yan yung sinabi ng PSA 265. Ano pa meron sa PSA 265? Yun lang. Yung sa PSA 265, ang sinasabi lang nun, you have to determine whether deficiencies in the internal control have been identified. Siyempre, kung in-apply nyo na yung PSA 315, ma-identify nyo na yung mga weakness or deficiencies doon sa internal control. So, nirequire lang siya ng PSA 265 na i-document ninyo yung mga deficiencies or weaknesses in the internal control. Tapos, aside doon, di ba, na-identify nyo na ano yung mga material deficiencies. Kailangan yung material deficiencies or significant deficiencies na yon, yun yung dapat i-communicate nyo sa those charged with governance, to those charged with governance. Nakukuha po ba? Nagigets po ba? Nakukuha po ba?
Yes po.
All right, okay. So, last na lang. Kasi ito, napag-aralan nyo naman na kasi ito sa inyong operations audit. Meron kasi tayong tinatawag na components of internal control. So, ayan, components of internal control. Para masabi nating maganda ang isang internal control, meron siyang tinatawag na component. So, meron tayong 5 component. Ano yung 5 component na iyon? Number 1 is
Control environment.
control environment. That's correct. Why do we need to check the control environment? Why do we need to check the control environment in an internal control? Kasi yun yung requirement ng PSA 315. Para maintindihan mo yung entity saka yung environment niya, you have to understand as well the internal control kasi ang internal control, merong control environment. Nakukuha po ba? So, nagigets po ba?
Yes po.
Alright. Next is risk assessment. That's the second component of internal control. Why do you need to assess the risk doon sa internal control? To check, di ba? To check if internal control is good or bad. Para ma-check din natin further kung ang control risk ba is low or high. That's why you need to assess the risk. Under internal control, marami tayong mga klase ng risk. Yung pinag-aralan natin kanina kasi ano lang yan, inherent risk, control risk, detection risk. Pero under kasi internal control, there are a lot of risks involved. Meron tayong tinatawag na capacity risk, ano pa? Technological risk. Ano pa yung mga nakikita ninyo mga klase ng risk? Political risk, concentration risk, credit risk. So maraming klase involved sa risk assessment ng isang internal control. Isa pa, process risk. So yan, mga klase yan ng risk. 'Diba? Yung inherent risk, control risk, detection risk, sa audit risk model natin yun. Although, yung iba kasi dito, like capacity risk, it could be a controllable risk. Diba? It's a control risk. Kasi nga, under siya ng internal control. Alright. So, that's why we need to assess the risk involved doon sa internal control. Ikatlong component ng internal control. Ikatlong component,
Information and communication system.
information, ayan, information and communication systems. Ayan. Why do we need to consider the information and communication systems as one of the components of internal control? Bakit kaya, class? Bakit kaya natin i-consider as one of the components of internal control ang isang information and communication system? Focus tayo sa FS audit by considering the internal control. Tapos yung component niya, information and communication system. Bakit kaya natin kailangan ito i-consider? Anyone from the class? Anyone from the class? Okay, sirit na. Kasi, you know what? The financial statement is communicated to users of the financial information. Kapag na-delay ang financial statement at hindi na-communicate on time doon sa mga users of the financial information, then kayo bilang auditor, red flag na sa inyo yon. Red flag na po yun sa inyo na ay bakit hindi nyo na ibibigay on time yung financial statement doon sa mga interested users. That means to say may problema kayo sa information and communication system ninyo. Baka may problema sa inyong internal control, lalo na doon sa reporting process. So, kasi ano ba yung accounting? Accounting is the language of the business. Therefore, dapat timely nako-communicate yung results ng operation, yung financial position ng company. Nakukuha po ba? Nagigets po ba? That's why you need to consider information and communication system. Nagigets po ba, class?
Apo.
Yes po.
Alright. Okay. So, kung magfo-focus kayo sa internal auditing, yung information and communication system, marami pa yung discussion dyan. Hindi lang tayo nakafocus sa financial statement. Nakafocus tayo dun sa transaction level. Paano ba nako-communicate yung mga transactions? Paano nako-consider na yung transaction is valid? Paano nako-consider na yung transaction is void? Paano nako-communicate kung merong error doon sa process? Paano na-prevent? Di ba? Paano na-detect? Yun yung information and communication system under internal control. Tapos kino-consider natin yung internal auditing or operational auditing. But here, what we are trying to discuss is the FS audit. So yun yung aking binibigay sa inyo. Number 4. Ano naman yung number 4?
Control activities.
Control activities. That's correct, no? So ano yung mga control activities? Anyone from the class? What is control activities?
Performance reviews.
Control activities, di ba? These are policies, di ba? Policies and procedures that exercises control or implements control. Kaya nga control activities. Because there is a control environment at yung control environment na yan is subject to risk. Kasi may mga inherent risk, may control risk. So subject sa risk yung control environment at then yung control process, kailangan may control activities. Sabihin natin, yung pera, kapag yung pera, nilagay mo lang sa lamesa, may 1 milyon sa lamesa, pera, ikaw, pumasok ka, walang nakakakita, walang CCTV, kukuha ka ba? Kukuha ba kayo, class? Walang nakakakita. Walang madilim, hindi rin makikita ni ng nasa itaas. Madilim. Kukuha ba kayo, class? Nagdadalawang isip? Nagdadalawang isip, class? Walang nakakakita, hindi nakikita nung nasa itaas, ng divine. Pero nakakakita yung nasa ibaba kasi sanay siya sa dilim. So nakikita yung ginagawa ninyo. So kukuha ba kayo, class?
Hindi po.
Hindi po.
Hindi pa din. Okay. Because you are being guided by your theological principles, di ba? Or deontological approach. Parang sinasabi ninyo na what is good for the many will be good for the company. So hindi ako kukuha. So ina-apply mo yung deontological approach. So, ayan. Ngayon, syempre applying audit kapag merong presence ng opportunity, incentives, pressure, normally ang isang employee, gagawin niya yon kasi wala naman nakakita, walang CCTV. Open yung pintuan, sasabihin mo, yung palay na yung lumalapit sa manok, di tutukain na ng manok. Diba? So, syempre, kapag may ganong possible na mangyari, you have to implement control activities. Hindi ka pwede maglagay ng pera lang sa lamesa. You have to safeguard your resources. Ilagay mo sa vault, ilagay mo sa petty cash box, dapat may susi yung petty cash box. Hindi mo lang pwedeng ilagay yung petty cash sa loob ng petty cash box pero nabubuksan. Yung vault, ang password 1, 2, 3 lang. Dapat, syempre, series of combination, yung mahirap ma-identify. Diba? So, yun yung proper control activities. So, control activities involves policies and procedures that help ensure that management directives are carried out. So, kasi syempre, sa internal auditing, sa operational auditing, meron tayong operational policies and procedures. Kailangan masunod kung ano yung operational policy, operational procedure through control activities. Otherwise, kung hindi masusunod yon, hindi okay yung control activities mo. At matindi yung risk involved na nandoon sa loob ng company, ng organization. And then last one is
Monitoring.
monitoring. So monitoring, syempre, kasi bakit natin kailangan i-monitor yung internal control? Kasi not at all times, the internal control policies and procedures are always applicable. Meron kasing internal control policies and procedures na hindi na siya applicable in the future. Sabihin natin ang cheque dati pwedeng itago, ipadala sa sobre. Kasi noon, pag nagpapadala ng cheque ang mga customer, pinapadala sa koreo or snail mail. So sabihin na lang na, eto na ipadala na namin yung bayad namin ha. Dadating na dyan yung, anong tawag doon? Yung nagdadala, yung mailman. Diba? So dadating na dyan yung mailman, mga 2 to 3 days, nandaan yung cheque. So ngayon, hindi na siya applicable ngayon kasi ang dami ng branches ng bank. So kailangan pag na-receive mo na yung cheque, the following day, yun na yung i-deposit. Di ba meron nga tayong tinatawag sa management accounting or management advisory services na 3 o'clock habit. So yung 3 o'clock habit natin, before 3 o'clock, kailangan ma-deposit na yung cheque para ma-count siya as deposits for that day. Di ba? So noon yon. Ngayon kasi, iba-iba na yung clearing time. Sa BPI hanggang 1 o'clock, sa BDO hanggang 6 p.m. pa, East-West Bank hanggang 3 p.m. Pero dati kasi, 3 o'clock sabay-sabay lahat sila. Ayan. So imagine niyo yung 3 o'clock habit, di ba? Hindi na siya magandang internal control policy kasi hindi na siya relevant sa current situation natin. Alright. So these are the components of internal control. Ngayon, ang internal control kasi, meron tayong tinatawag na internal control framework. So lalagay ko dito internal control framework. So yung internal control framework na to has been promoted and structured by, sino yung gumawa ng internal control framework? Natatanda pa po ba ito sa ating operational audit or internal audit?
Koso.
COSO. That's correct, no? COSO. So what's COSO means? Commission ano po yan? Commission of Sponsoring
Organization.
Diba? COSO is Commission of Sponsoring Organization of the Treadway Commission. So yun yung ibig sabihin ng COSO. So si COSO pala, nag-formulate siya ng internal control framework structure kung saan meron 3 objectives na pinopromote or sinasatisfy ang isang internal control. Una na dyan, yung operating objectives. Sinasatisfy yon ng internal control. Ano pa? Ikalawa, yung financial reporting objectives. So, yan, lagyan natin dyan. Financial reporting objectives. At yung ikatlo, yung compliance objective. Ito yung mga sinasatisfy ng isang internal control framework. At para masatisfy itong 3 objectives na to, you have to consider the components of internal control. Ito yung components. So number 1 is the control environment. So kasama pala ito as part ng structure ng internal control framework. So lagyan natin dyan. So yan, control environment. Second one na component, risk assessment. Pangatlo, ano yung pangatlo? Information and communication systems. Ayusin natin. Information and communication systems. And then, ika-4 is control activities. And then, ika-5 is monitoring. So, para ma-satisfy daw pala itong 3 objectives ng internal control, you have to consider the 5 components of internal control. And aside from that, you have to apply these 5 components sa bawat levels ng organization. Diba? So, lagyan natin, ito yung nasa gilid siya. So, this, lahat ng ito ay dapat natin i-consider sa iisang, yan, lagyan natin dyan. Sa bawat levels pala, no, not iisa. Sa bawat levels ng organization. So meron tayong tinatawag na entity-wide or entity level. Meron tayong tinatawag na division-wide level. And then unit-wide level. Diba? So, lahat na yan. So, sa entity-wide, kino-consider natin itong control risk, risk assessment, information and communication system, control activities, monitoring. Ganun din sa division-wide. Ganun din sa unit-wide na level. So, lahat ng yan para masatisfy lahat ng objective. So, hindi lang applicable yung operating objective sa isang department, yung financial reporting sa isang department, yung compliance sa isang department. Lahat yan applicable sa bawat department. So it could be on an entity level, division level, unit level, department level, single level, applicable siya. Ayan. Okay. So any more questions, class? Any more questions?
Wala po.
Wala pa. All right, class. So we're now done with the internal control consideration. Ngayon, may isisend rin akong link for the details ng internal control. Kasi related yun sa operational audit. So, panoorin nyo na lang. All right, class. So let's move doon sa isa pang topic. Okay, thank you so much. All right. So stop presenting. May isa pa ba tayong link?